So I want to start first with a section on the birth, ascension, and death of world leaders and other noble figures in history as our first set of charts. So the very first one I want to start with, actually, which turns out to be the most famous, probably eclipse one in history, and even though it's connected with the religion and some of the sort of mythology surrounding it, it's still potentially the most famous example in history, which is the death of Jesus. So Jesus, of course, in the Gospel of Matthew was famously said to be born under some unknown astrological alignment that signified his birth. But then even in the Bible at the end of his life, there is actually eclipse imagery on the day of the death of Jesus. So especially in the Gospel of Luke, 23 sections 44 to 45, in the New American Version of the Bible, it says, quote, "It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon because of an eclipse of the sun." And then there's two other Gospels that also note a sudden midday darkness. So this is often interpreted as an eclipse taking place in the middle of the day. And, you know, regardless of like debates over the historicity of that or what have you, it means that very early on in the Western tradition of Western like culture and religion, we have this story about the death of a notable figure at the time of an eclipse, which sort of, at the very least, sort of like cements that in our sort of like collective psyche, I think, to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Alexander the Great. So Alexander was probably born July 20th, 356 BCE, which was 10 days before a lunar eclipse in the sign of Aquarius, which took place on July 30th. The Battle of Gaugamela was preceded by a lunar eclipse by about a week. Constantine was actually proclaimed emperor by his army on July 25th, 306 CE, and this is 2 days before a solar eclipse in Leo on July 27th. So there's a very good chance that the Edict of Milan, which is one of the things that Constantine was the most known for, which basically established legally like Christianity in the Roman Empire, one of the things he was most known for in terms of that occurred right around the time of a lunar eclipse. Constantine himself died May 22nd of 337 CE, and that was 5 days after a solar eclipse in Taurus, which occurred on May 17th. So he was proclaimed emperor on an eclipse, he legalized Christianity on an eclipse, and then he died on an eclipse. The next example is Napoleon, who was actually defeated at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18th of 1815, and this was 3 days before a lunar eclipse, which occurred on June 21st in the sign of Sagittarius. Moving on, the next example, the Emperor Hirohito, who was the Emperor of Japan during World War II. So Hirohito was actually born about 4 or 5 days before a lunar eclipse in the sign of Scorpio. After World War II, the US and the Allies basically forced Hirohito to issue a declaration, which is known now as the Humanity Declaration, and this occurred 2 days before a solar eclipse. And what happened is that in this declaration, Hirohito denied the concept of his own divinity, because up to that point, the Emperor of Japan had been treated as a god by the people of Japan for centuries.
When the Japanese military invaded Manchuria, beginning with a skirmish in Mukden, September 19th, 1931, this was 7 days following a solar eclipse in Virgo. And there was also the signing of the Axis Pact. Germany, Italy, and Japan on September 27th, 1940, signed the Axis Pact as the Second World War was already underway, but really sort of cementing their alliance. And this was 3 days prior to a total solar eclipse at 8 Libra and 19 days before a lunar eclipse in Aries.
Abraham Lincoln was famously assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and this occurred just 4 days after a lunar eclipse. The second eclipse in the series occurred right in the middle of this whole funeral procession when a solar eclipse occurred on April 25th in Taurus of 1865.
The eclipse on April 10th that occurred just before he was murdered also occurred one day after Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. And this is something else that we keep seeing, sort of like Waterloo or Gaugamela. There's also the ending of a war that's coincident with Lincoln's assassination.
And this was not the only eclipse in Lincoln's history. It turns out that the Gettysburg Address, which is his most famous speech and one of the most famous speeches in American history, happened in that range in between eclipses.
And his re-election on November 8th occurred in between a solar eclipse in Scorpio on October 30th and a lunar eclipse in Taurus on November 13th.
Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And this happened in that space in between eclipses. Barack Obama was born 6 days before a solar eclipse in the sign of Leo. His first inauguration, there was an eclipse that occurred in Aquarius, which is also his rising sign, just 6 days after he was inaugurated. And then interestingly, he was re-elected 4 years later on November 6th, 2012. And then right after that, there was an eclipse in the sign of Scorpio on November 13th. It also happened with Trump, it happened with Biden, and it also happened with George W. Bush, and probably goes back further. Donald Trump, who was born literally the same day as a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. It's one of the most striking things about Trump's chart is that he was born the day of a lunar eclipse. The British royal family, eclipses are just all over their history over the past century. Prince William was born the day of a solar eclipse in the sign of Cancer, literally the same day. His parents, Charles and Diana, were married at the same time as an eclipse. Prince William's later wife, Kate Middleton, was also born the same day as a lunar eclipse. Then his mother, Princess Diana, died just a few days after an eclipse in, 1997. And then finally his father, Prince Charles, now King Charles, his coronation occurred the very day of an eclipse just earlier this year in 2023. There are eclipses going further back in their family history. So Queen Elizabeth, Charles's mother, ascended to the throne close to an eclipse when her father, George VI, died on February 6th, 1952.
George VI is just the first of three examples in the 20th century of this, because when his father, when he became king, when his brother abdicated. His brother had been King Edward VIII, who famously abdicated to the throne to marry an American divorcee.
So this is Queen Elizabeth's father who died and made her queen.
Right.
This is who we're talking about now, is Queen Elizabeth's father, who is George VI.
That's right. Edward VIII abdicated the throne on December 10th, 1936. It was just 3 days before a solar eclipse on December 13th.
Okay, so George VI was Elizabeth's father. He became king when Edward VIII abdicated. What's interesting about this is he abdicated the throne on December 10th, 1936, and then there was a solar eclipse 3 days later in Sagittarius on December 13th. His solar return that year ended up being that eclipse.
Right.
He actually then gets married under eclipses in the subsequent year, like 6 months later, I believe, right?
6 months later, yeah. Which is also that's also around when George VI has his coronation. Is also the same, during the same eclipse period. George V had become king when his father, King Edward VII, died. He died May 6th, the eclipse was moonlit.
Basically, all of the ascensions and descensions, and especially deaths of kings in the 20th century, in the British royal family, were all happening on eclipses. So that's just like, can we take a moment just to process that? Like, that's just incredible to see the fall of Constantinople. And this marked essentially the end of the Byzantine Empire, and in some ways it was the end of the Roman Empire. This occurred on May 29th, 1453, and it was preceded by a few days by a lunar eclipse, which occurred on May 22nd in Sagittarius. And what's really interesting about this eclipse is that in the history books, um, it actually would have risen over the horizon, and they describe both sides of the battle witnessing this, and it was like a blood red crescent moon. The Titanic sank in between eclipses, in between two eclipses. The Reichstag fire in 1933 coincided with an eclipse.
Mhm.
And this solar eclipse, interestingly, was opposite to a Mars-Neptune conjunction. The very first successful test of an atomic bomb, which was the Trinity test, which occurred July 16th, 1945, happened just after a solar eclipse in Cancer that was conjunct Saturn on July 9th, 1945. Chernobyl happened April 26th, 1986, and there was a lunar eclipse in Scorpio just 2 days earlier on April 24th. Interestingly, this lunar eclipse was conjunct Pluto. The COVID pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, really became known to the world under a set of eclipses that occurred in late 2019 and early 2020. January 9th, so this is just 2 days before the January 11th lunar eclipse, the second eclipse, the World Health Organization announces a mysterious coronavirus-related pneumonia in Wuhan, China. The eclipses are not the only thing going on astrologically at that time, because in early January there was also a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which had also coincided with the AIDS outbreak 40 years earlier, or at least when AIDS became known, as well as other major losses of life. And then a few months after that, there was an alignment of Mars and Saturn,
Jupiter.
and Jupiter and Pluto in Capricorn all at the same time. And that was when the lockdowns happened in the US and pretty much across the world at that point in March and April of 2020. The Wall Street crash of 1929 happened very close to a set of eclipses. Bitcoin was actually invented and introduced by a mysterious anonymous founder who we don't actually know the real identity of this person. But the very first indications that he was in the process of creating Bitcoin happened in the summer of 2008, when bitcoin.org was registered as a domain name on August 18th, 2008. And this was just 2 days after a lunar eclipse in Aquarius that occurred on August 16th, 2008. Bitcoin reached a new high when it first hit or started to go above $20,000 in value for each Bitcoin. And that happened exactly on an eclipse, which happened on November 30th, 2020. And then 6 months later, we got the next set of eclipses. And what happens is that right on those eclipses, the FTX collapse happened. So it all happened right around the lunar eclipse in November. And this was a lunar eclipse on November 8th in the sign of Taurus. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774. And this was an event that would eventually lead to the formation of the United States of America as a separate country from Great Britain. And the very same day as the First Continental Congress met, there was an eclipse in the sign of Virgo. It was a solar eclipse, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the most stunning ones, because this is one where it's like not, it's not like a few days before, it's not like a few days after, it's not like a week before, a week after. Literally the same day that the First Continental Congress met, there was a solar eclipse in the sign of Virgo.
Yeah.
Einstein's theory of relativity was famously confirmed as a result of an eclipse, and this was connected to the Eddington expedition, where an eclipse took place on May 29th, 1919, and this was basically used in order to confirm Einstein's theory of relativity, which is a huge turning point in human history and in science and in terms of our understanding of the world, which built on Newton's previous theories surrounding gravity, but also changed them in a major way and set up for a large part our current understanding of how the universe works over the past century. And interestingly, there was a solar eclipse in Pisces a week before his birthday or his solar return that year. The United Nations was basically founded on June 26th, 1945, and this was literally the day after a lunar eclipse occurred in Capricorn on June 25th. Alexander Graham Bell famously made the first telephone call on March 10th, 1876, and this was the exact same day as a lunar eclipse in the sign of Virgo.
Yeah, I mean, Virgo, a Mercury ruled sign, et cetera, et cetera.
Tim Berners-Lee submitted the proposal for the World Wide Web on March 12th, 1989. And this is right in between a set of eclipses, or right after a set of eclipses, I should say.
Yeah, and funny enough, when it started, the internet was connected by phone lines. So thank you, Alexander Graham Bell, for that. There's almost like a link between those two.
Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a bus in Alabama happened just 2 days after a lunar eclipse. The U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964 occurred just a week after a lunar eclipse. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 also coincided with an eclipse. Clearly, I think we've shown here that eclipses can sometimes coincide with or can represent major turning points in world history. We just had this solar eclipse in Libra, and there's some of the stuff going on with Israel going into Gaza. And exactly 19 years earlier on the same day, Israel was doing a similar thing in terms of going into Gaza. So sometimes there's these repetitions of eclipses at the same degrees, which can connect together events in 19-year periods or other increments of time, depending on the repetition.
Yeah. For a period of time, you'll have a sequence of these same eclipses at the same degree every 19 years.
And then there's also other patterns like the Saros series, which is sort of closer to like an 18.5 year type series. That's something I've talked about previously. I don't think that eclipses cause events to happen, but they just act as like omens or indicators that something important is happening at that point in time. And that's obviously like a part of a broader discussion that's been going on for 2,000 years in the astrological community of whether astrology works through signs or through causes or through the planets acting as signs or cause. Wondering if we think the eclipses are causing like the Civil Rights Act to be passed in 1964 or what have you. Like, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I do think there is a weird energy that happens in the month of eclipses, and especially in that 2-week period in between two eclipses, and we're kind of experiencing that now, but I don't know that the feeling of it, of like eclipse energy, quote unquote, if you want to call it that, if that's due to some actual thing that's tangible, or if it's just due to the observation that the eclipses are coinciding with very important turning points at that point in time. But I tend to err more on the side of thinking that they are just indicators or markers of important points in time rather than causes.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole kettle of fish in itself. My tendency is to, or my verdict, if I have one, is to think that if there's a mechanism involved, if there's something that's making things happen, it's something beyond the planets and stars that's making the planets turn and making us, have civil rights acts or whatever. That if anything's causing any of this, it's not the planets, it's something that's sort of beyond all of it.